Well, hey, friends, another episode of the bonus content. And I want to tell you a story. When I was 13 years old, I got a job, and I found this job in the newspaper, and it said to show up in Scarborough. If you're familiar with Toronto, it's the other end of town. Had my dad drop me off, gave me some bus fare to get home. And it said it was a sales job and cash paid daily. I now know that should really make you nervous, but at the time I just thought that sounds great. And so I showed up, they took my picture, they put it on a badge, they gave me a branded sweater of a child's charity I've never heard of. And as I Googled it now, because now Google's a thing, I don't even think it was a real charity. They gave me a binder with colorful pictures of children. And I was told, your job is to go door to door and raise money for these children. And 30% of the money that you raise, you get to take home as a fundraising fee. And I was like, huh? And they're like, and by the way, if you raise over this amount of money a night, you take home 50% of what you make. Now, I was over my head, and it was going so fast. I remember then within 30 minutes, I'm in a minivan with a whole bunch of other canvassers who are going to knock on doors with me. And as we're driving to the neighborhood, I remember so vividly, they start giving me advice. This one guy, he's probably like in his 20s. He's like, I tell people I'm a volunteer from high school and I'm completing my community service hours because people are far more likely to give to volunteers. And another person, she was an older lady, she says, I knock on doors where they say no soliciting. And then just as they come to the door, I pretend I just noticed the sign. And then they see me as someone who's genuine and just, a little lost and aloof. And then they usually give me money. And I'm like, I'm sitting there and I'm just so over my head. I'm feeling gross. And so I start walking and I'm knocking on doors and I'm getting rejected. And finally, someone starts asking me questions. And I start looking through my binder, which when the salesperson is looking through their binder trying to find an answer, it's like I could read the label. Like, what, And so anyways, they're so genuine. And they're like, I've never heard of this charity before. Is there a phone number I can call to verify the legitimacy? In my head, I'm thinking to myself, like, I've never heard about this charity either, right? Like, this is not going well. So I quickly find another worker. I give them my gear and I head out. I jump on a subway. I find myself back to Eglinton West. I'm back in my neighborhood. I'm home and I'm traumatized. Fast forward to a couple decades later, I have my own house and people knock on my door and I first freak out. And then I get there, and if there's ever people selling something or trying to, raise money for something, I just gotta be honest, I'm super skeptical. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that it's all, hacks. And in fact, I notice there's a lot more checks and balances in the industry. If you agree to give, usually they actually refuse to take your money right there. They actually, have a phone number to call and, but sometimes when I'm chatting with them, I just start to wonder because of my experience. And I just want to ask this question. I want to be like, do you believe in this organization? Do you give monthly? Like, do you actually believe in it enough to give of your own money to it? Or are you just here to make a buck? Now, my wife would never let me ask that kind of question, but I want to know, not are you a good salesperson, but do you believe this? I want to know that the person telling me about something is telling me because they're genuinely excited and believe in it and the opportunity that it offers and not just an agenda. Especially in the age of social media, we're so skeptical. We can tell right away when someone starts pushing a product and it's like, oh, they just got sponsored, right? Like, we're so skeptical about people's intentions, and I still freak out when people ring the doorbell. Well, this weekend, let's just pause on childhood Mark, 13 years old for a second. Let's get fast forward to this weekend. We talked about a man who had 5,000 demons, transformed by Jesus, and Jesus, sends the demons out into the pigs. It's a wild story. You should listen to it if you missed it. And Jesus says, go and tell people what God has done for you. No training, no branded sweater, no list of things to not say or use this tactic or that tactic. Just tell them what God's done for you. He doesn't say, make sure you include this or draw this. He tells them, just tell them what God does for you or did for you. And I asked the question, are there some of you who've been scared to share your faith with people because you don't feel it's your gift, or you don't feel like you're that kind of person, or you don't feel prepared, or questions may come up that you may not have the answers to, you don't feel like you're great with words, or maybe you are a processor and you're like, I never know how to respond in the moment, you're not a salesperson. And today I wanted to unpack the statement, what if you just told people what God had done for you? What if you just told people about your experience? Because telling people about your experience is something that we all can do. Think about it. When you return to work or return to school after vacation, you don't stay up late the night before and think, what if someone asks me about my vacation? I have to prepare notes and have to make sure I have all the details. I better have all the best pictures ready on my phone so right when I unlock it, they're right there. We don't want to miss a detail, right? Like, they may not fall in love with the beach that I fell in love with. I just need to be so prepared, right? It's like, We just tell people. We just tell people our experience. You're at the water cooler. That was the vacation. 10 minutes later, you're still talking about your tour guide who was so cool and all this stuff, right? It's like you could tell that story 10 different ways, 10 different people, all in one day, and you would have shared your vacation. You never get home and think, oh, I forgot to tell Tommy about the way they arranged our towels on the bed. Of course not. That's not what telling your experience is about. It's not about scientifically checking all the boxes. It's experientially sharing what you experienced. We can all do that. We can all share our experience. We all have done that. Well, what if sharing your faith began with sharing your experiences of what God has done for you? Recently, I was getting a massage and I was getting it alone. We used to have couples massages, but Trifina says I'm too chatty. So now I just go, it's just me and the one massage therapist, and I'm chatting away and asking questions, and the conversation's going. And, the conversation turns and he says, so, what brought you to Guelph? And I say, well, I came here for a job. And it's like, well, what do you do? I brace myself because you never know how this answer is going to go. I say, well, I'm a pastor. And they're like, oh, cool. Well, what does that mean? Like, do you work at a church? I'm like, yeah. Like, well, what church? And I say, well, Lakeside. And they're like, oh, I actually know that church. I've been there for a rental. And they were very nice to us. I'm like, oh, great. And so anyways, they said, so what brought you to Guelph? And so I begin to share my story, a story that I've shared, probably 100 times, always in different ways, never scripted, just my experiential story, right? I talk about, burning out as a pastor, having a mental breakdown, not sure I'd ever go back to being a pastor, and just trying to figure out what was next, and getting this call from a 519 number and not even knowing where Guelph was. And, as the story progressed, I just continued to share the story. And I just said this, I said, and this might sound crazy to you, but I believe God speaks to us. And that was kind of the turning point for us. We felt God speak to us, and we actually felt God leading us to this city. And while it hasn't been easy to, come here and move our whole family, God's given us peace, and it's been amazing. That was kind of the end of the conversation as it kind of wrapped up, and I shared what God had done for me. That was it. I wonder how the conversation goes that night. I have no idea, right? I had this weird client who came in and he's telling me the story of how God spoke to him and he moved his entire family to Guelph. I don't know. I'm looking forward to my next massage and the next conversation. But friends, here's the question, the simple question. What has God done for you? Did God heal you of a sickness, an addiction, or a traumatic experience? Did he challenge you in your life? Did he meet you in a dark night and bring peace in the midst of tragedy? Did God overwhelm you with love when your marriage crumbled? Did he speak to you in a dream? Are you like a friend of mine where the doctor told your parents you wouldn't survive birth? Did God heal your cancer? Did a surgeon look you in the eye and say that she never sees this kind of stuff? Friends, I know we don't all have the gift of evangelism, but we can all tell stories of what has happened to us and what God has done in our lives. So let me leave you with two things, an encouragement and some tips. Here's my encouragement to you first. Don't worry about sweaters, binders, or tactics to get people on the Jesus team. Take time to reflect on what God has done for you, whether that means talking it out with a friend over coffee or journaling out in your prayer time. Step one, just be aware and be reminded of what God has done for you, because you can't share what you don't remember. So even if you're in your groups this week, maybe even start the habit. We do this every staff meeting when we start. We just say, where did you see God move in the last 7 days? We just regularly make it a practice to celebrate where God is moving in our lives. And secondly, as you start the practice of telling people what God has done for you, here are 2 lines, not the only ones. These are just my experience, 2 lines that I find so disarming when sharing about what Jesus has done in my life. Here's the first one. Hey, this might sound crazy to you, but your story, right? Hey, this might sound crazy to you, but then God spoke to me. That's what I said to the massage therapist, or God healed me, or God challenged me, or this might sound crazy to you, but I had this dream, right? Like, just call it out. Second line that I think is so helpful is, hey, this is something I'm convinced of, and you may see it differently. This one's so helpful. Something I'm convinced of, but you may see it differently. Here's why it's so helpful. We live in such a polarized world, and statistics actually tells us when someone digs in on hard truth, someone who sees it differently will dig in even harder on the other side. If you start by saying, hey, you're free to see this differently. This is my experience. It is incredibly disarming. And it's actually what Jesus did. As we saw this weekend in the story, he didn't force himself on people and double down. This weekend, we saw him leave when he was requested to. So here's the bottom line, friends. Don't be 13-year-old Mark trying to sell a product you don't understand. Be a Jesus follower, telling everyone you meet your experience of Jesus. That's a great place to start. Have a good week.